Okay, make sure that you have grabbed your guided notes. We're going to be talking about decolonization, and we are getting really close to the end, guys. We only have a couple more lectures to go. So this one will be pretty brief. You guys are going to be doing group projects about decolonization in specific areas, so I won't go into a lot of detail about particulars. And then after you do your group presentations, I'm going to pick up a few loose ends and discuss some biggies like India and decolonization there, as well as a few issues in the Middle East with the creation of Israel and a bunch of refugees after that state was created, as Palestinians sort of became stateless. So we're going to be talking about a lot of these issues, and you guys are going to be getting some of the details through your own work, and then of course through next week's work. So this just gives you a brief idea of when various places became decolonized, and you can see the redder it is, pretty much the more recent. The more recently it was decolonized. So you can see most of Africa is either orange or red, and all of the stuff that used to belong to the Soviet Union up here is also red, so that puts it into the 1990s, and you've got a lot of different things going on here. But in essence, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of East Asia are decolonized in the time period after World War II. Okay, decolonization. First, let's define it. Decolonization, very simply, is freeing a nation of control and coercion by an imperial power. So that can be done in a way that is very explicit, like politically. You can become no longer tied to, for example, Britain or France, or in, for example, Congo, you'd no longer be tied to Belgium anymore. It can also be thought of as becoming free of cultural or economic influences of more powerful nations. So this is the focus of many of these areas. For example, technically, South Africa was already decolonized by the time you got into the post-World War II period. However, it was under the cultural influence of the white minority within South Africa. So when we talk about decolonization in that sense, we're talking about the majority of people becoming active participants within their political system. In terms of economic influence, I think one of the biggest examples here would be that of China. China was not specifically or explicitly politically colonized by anyone. It was carved up into spheres of economic influence. And in the period after World War II, specifically in 1949 with the Communist Revolution, it tries to throw off those economic bonds that have held it in subjugation to the West since the period of the Opium Wars, about 100 years before that time. Strayer was very explicit about the idea of nation-states winning over empires in the War of Ideologies. If you think way back to the very beginning of this course, we talked about in the building of an empire, one of the very first things that any empire needs to do is create an ideology around which to organize its goals and motivations. And the idea of the civilizing mission, I think, was sort of the benign ideology around which Europeans went out and colonized areas of Africa and Asia. Sorry. However, turn my cell phone volume all the way down. Okay, anyway, those ideas were something that empires could really sort of, like, I don't know, get their head around and all get behind. That's sort of the benign idea. There's also more malicious ones, for example, economic exploitation of colonies. After World War II, it becomes very difficult to support either of those ideas and the idea of national self-determination wins out. The idea of various groups of people who define themselves as a nation having their own state, having a nation state, is the sort of foundational idea, I think, of the 20th century. It's going to massively impact everything, really from the beginning of the 1900s on through right to the present, when we have, the current crisis going on in the Ukraine, about how that nation state will identify itself and how various groups within the modern Ukrainian nation state will identify themselves. So nation state wins out over empire, and that's an important concept. Will you all add, where it says was winning in the war of ideologies, if you would please add over empires. So the idea of nation states wins over that of empires. All right, Strayer discusses 3 causes of decolonization, and he goes on for quite a while about these, and they're a little bit complex. So I'm going to go through them one by one. First, obvious internal contradictions. Empires and their mother countries, France and Britain in particular, espoused ideas like democracy, freedom, self-determination. Especially during World War II, when they were fighting dominating powers like Imperial Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. They framed the battles of World War II as a battle between freedom and democracy on one hand, and dictatorship and oppression on the other. It was very, very difficult after World War II to hold those two ideas in the same mind and not have a serious contradiction in terms. After World War II, the way that fight was framed as a battle of freedom versus dictatorship, it's really difficult to then go over to your colleagues and say, JK, that wasn't for you. Another problem is that there are educated elites and World War veterans, both World War I and World War II, and they're going to gain a voice through their experience both in universities and on the battlefield. First, veterans fighting for the mother country made them, want a voice, and also realize that their mother countries are not sort of the enlightened, perfect societies that they were portrayed as. In addition, especially for educated elites, Enlightenment principles that we've already talked about, like freedom, self-determination, democracy, balance of powers, all that stuff was taught to educated elites who lived in the colonies. So people who were colonized went and they received this education that was steeped in Enlightenment principles. And educated elites were angry that they are, A, under the thumb of an imperial power, and B, treated as racial inferiors, despite the fact that they have this education. Also, economically, this is Strayer's third reason, it's not necessary or possible for Europeans to really hold on to colonies any longer after World War II. All European powers who were fighting in World War II and the United States, everybody used rationing, for example, as a way to effectively fight in that war of attrition in the total war that was World War II. It doesn't automatically get like all peaches and roses and unicorns and ponies right after that war is finished. Especially for Britain and France, their economies were sapped by the experience of World War II. Not only that, they didn't have to hold on to colonies to remain economically strong. Most of the time, most of the time, colonies wanted to maintain a relationship economically with the former mother country. The best example of this, I think, is in something called the British Commonwealth of Nations. And if you would, please note this out to the side. The British Commonwealth of Nations is a great example of this. The British Commonwealth of Nations is a collection of former colonies who are now in an equal status partnership with Britain, and they share economic and cultural benefits with one another because of their sort of past historical relationship. So the British Commonwealth of Nations is a really nice example of that lack of a need to keep holding on to these colonies. Of course, there are a lot of individuals as well who voice their desire to be free. Mandela and Gandhi were two explicitly that were discussed in the chapter 23 of Strayer. There were a number of others that were mentioned. Nkrumah in Ghana. He discussed Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Nehru in India, among a lot of others. All right. There are going to be a lot of factors that will impact how a new country does economically and politically. First of all, was the decolonization process violent? Most often, if the decolonization process is violent, the country is highly militarized at the point of independence, and a highly militarized country is not necessarily going to have an easy path toward a successful transition to an independent country. Also, how enlightened had the colonizing power been? I think a lot of this is direct versus indirect control. So out to the side of the second bullet point, will you please note, was colonial control direct or indirect? For the most part, French colonies were held directly, and French law and administrators were imposed on people, and British colonies were held indirectly. And a lot of educated elites in areas like India actually exerted pretty significant power at the local level, which gave them a leg up when the moment of decolonization came. So out to the side, we need to note whether or not there was direct or indirect colonial control. Okay, this is a huge one as well. Number 3, I want you to write beside this bullet, scramble for Africa. As with the scramble for Africa, many European nations divided their colonies based on not the needs of the colony or the logical places where the colonies should be divided based on the types of people who were living there. Instead, colonial mother countries divided their territories based on what was most convenient and useful for the colonial mother country. Oftentimes, what happened was the either splitting or putting together of ethnic, cultural, religious, linguistic groups that may or may not want to be together or separated. A lot of times, Europe actually does this maliciously. They intentionally put two groups together in a colonial boundary, intentionally to keep the people from working together effectively to throw off European control. So the scramble for Africa is the best example of this. Those boundaries that we see across the African continent today are pretty much formed by Europeans during the scramble for Africa, and they have nothing at all whatsoever to do with the desires of people who lived indigenously in Africa. All right, did a country have natural resources to exploit? Did the government exploit them efficiently, or were they unable to diversify their economy? I want you to write out to the side of this 2 different countries. I would like you to write out to the side OPEC nations, O-P-E-C, and those are in all capital letters, O-P-E-C. These are nations, this OPEC, OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Countries with a great natural resource like that had a leg up. However, I'd also like you to write out to the side Ghana and cocoa. Ghana and cocoa, as in chocolate. A lot of countries, like Ghana, had this really great natural resource, like everybody loves chocolate, right? However, the price of cocoa on the international market fluctuates pretty dramatically, and Ghana did not intentionally diversify its economy. It has a monocrop agricultural economy, growing chocolate, pretty much. And that is going to be a huge problem. So we see success stories. Some places with oil, for example, are able to exploit that natural resource and use it to industrialize other parts of their economy. thus joining the ranks of the westernized or industrialized powers, and you're going to see others that have these resources but don't use them effectively or don't have really the internal capacity to use that money effectively to industrialize other areas and create like a really good, diverse, deep economy. The other thing is, does the newly liberated country take a side in the Cold War? Pretty much the superpowers intervened a lot in a zillion different countries across the globe. Everywhere from like Afghanistan to Nicaragua got intervened in by the USA or the Soviet Union. There was a third path called the non-aligned movement, and the non-aligned powers, pretty much led by Nehru in India and Sukarno in Indonesia, sort of take an independent view of the Cold War, and this actually gives them some power on the world stage as both the US and the USSR kind of court these powers to win their favor. There are a number of challenges that will come with independence. Obviously, ethnic disputes, that comes a lot out of those borders. Those weak economies that are still dependent on industrialized nations which used to own them. A lot of times those weak economies were intentionally created by the colonizing power in order to better exploit the natural resources of that area. As countries attempt to industrialize, they also get a lot of debt. They get loans from both the IMF, which stands for the International Monetary Fund. Please write that out to the side, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And those loans have to be paid back with interest. Sometimes that creates a cycle of debt, and these developing nations are never able to extract themselves from that cycle. There's also a lot of social unrest, and the militaries of these nations often respond in order to restore order. We see that happen over and over and over again. I think Ghana is a really good example of that. There's also a lot of population growth. I want you to jot out to the side of that population control measures are an indicator of success. High population growth, I want you to write out to the side. Population control measures are an indicator of success. So, for example, the People's Republic of China, the one-child policy, which is now sort of on its way out, that one-child policy that they had in place was a huge help to them as they attempted to reform their economy and become an industrialized power. There's also resource depletion, right? If you've got a economy based on natural resources, as those resources are depleted, even in the case of agricultural products, right? Your land can become depleted and thus less productive. That can cause a huge problem because where are you going to get your money from after that? There's also a lack of, especially in directly held colonies, a lack of educational structure. And a lot of times what happens is people from these nations end up going into the developed world to have an education, and then they stay in the developed world because there are more opportunities there. This is called brain drain, and most developed nations or developing nations are dealing with that issue. There's also economic debt, right? If a country owes money to a stronger, fully industrialized, westernized power, it's sort of going to be always subject to that power, right? The borrower is slave to the lender. And I think that's true in a lot of cases in these developing world areas. Right, there are a number of patterns that are used by these newly forming nation states in order to decolonize themselves. Violence is a very common pattern. I have 3 examples here: Kenya, Algeria, and Vietnam. All 3 of these are forced to really fight wars in order to gain their own national sovereignty. Nonviolence is used extremely effectively by both India and South Africa, however, in order to get what they want. It allowed those nations to take the moral high ground, and they ended up negotiating their freedom from their mother country. A lot of nations gain unity through religion. For example, South Korea unifies around Christianity, which is a fact that probably not most people are familiar with. And Iran, of course, unifies around Islam during the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that you guys wrote about in the last question of the chapter about decolonization. You can also unify by industrializing and nationalizing your resources. This is the goal of Nkrumah in Ghana, Nasser and Sadat, who are leaders in Egypt, Allende in Chile, and Nehru in India. Communism, of course, provides sort of like a new way out of being imperialized, and it unites peasants and poor workers in opposition to their colonial mother country. Mao in China effectively utilizes this method, and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Of course, negotiation is a large part of this, especially when using nonviolence. Once a nation becomes independent, it has a number of different things that it's going to have to deal with in terms of what it wants to do in the future. It could have an economic focus or a religious focus. It could be violent or peaceful. It could go with Marxism or capitalism. It could try to have a democratic government or an authoritarian government. And new nations are going to have an overwhelming number of choices that they're going to have to deal with, and they will not always successfully come through this process. It's often a long, sort of hard-fought road to success as a newly independent nation. 3 words that I need you guys to remember: nationalism, self-determination, and national identity. We've talked about nationalism an awful lot, so if you would just note your own definition out to the side. I'll be looking at those, of course, when you turn in these guided notes. Self-determination has to do with the ability of a nation to freely choose its own path. The ability of a nation to freely choose its own path. And national identity. National identity is actually something that the College Board chose to create an essay around a few years ago. National identity is the way the members of a nation, let me revise this a little bit. The characteristics that the members of any given nation view themselves as sharing. The characteristics that the members of a nation view themselves as sharing. National identity, of course, is extremely finicky, right? Nations don't usually fit into neat little packages, right? They usually have deviations within them, and that's going to cause difficulties, of course, as nations begin to forge their way in this new world. I want to remind you that 6.2, global conflicts and their consequences, these are the targets that really discuss decolonization in detail. So check out your targets and make sure that you feel comfortable with those issues. All right, that is it for this lecture. Make sure that your guided notes are filled out. Oh, for heaven's sake, is this happening again? Of course it is.